It started as an ordinary day for Joe, a humble janitor with a quiet demeanor and an old, beat-up van he cherished. But things took a sharp turn when a group of arrogant riders, eager to show off, decided to turn his vehicle into their latest target for pranks. With no regard for Joe's hard work or the sentimental value of his van, they laughed, vandalized, and left a trail of destruction behind. What they didn't know was that Joe's calm appearance hid a past few could imagine. Years ago, he had been part of an elite special forces unit, trained for missions most wouldn't dare to dream of. The skills he had buried deep within were about to resurface in ways that would leave these riders regretting every reckless move they made. What happens next? Stick around, because this story is just getting started. The riders, feeling invincible, continued to laugh and joke, oblivious to the man watching from a distance. Joe had always been a quiet person, never one to draw attention, but that didn't mean he was weak. In fact, his training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to observe his surroundings, and to always keep a low profile. For years, he had kept his past hidden, working simple jobs to live a peaceful life after the chaos of his service. But now, as he watched the young men disrespect what he had worked for, something inside him stirred. The anger, the discipline, the focus, it all came rushing back. He wasn't just some janitor. He had once been a warrior. And those riders had just made a huge mistake. Joe stood up, slowly, his eyes narrowing. The game was about to change, but the riders had no idea what was coming. As Joe stood there, a storm of memories surged through him. His years in the special forces, the countless missions, and the relentless discipline that shaped him. His time in the field had taught him to endure pain and suffering, but it had also taught him to protect what mattered. And right now his van, his only possession that tied him to a life of simplicity, mattered more than ever. The riders, still oblivious to the growing danger, continued their taunts. One of them, a brash young man with a loud laugh, picked up a spray can and started tagging the side of Joe's van. His friends cheered him on, egging him to do more damage. But Joe wasn't just angry. He was calculating, sizing up each rider, and measuring how he could turn this situation around. In the distance, a few bystanders watched, unsure of whether to step in. They could sense the tension building but didn't know how to help. They only knew that something wasn't right. Joe's grip tightened around his fists, and the years of training began to resurface. But it wasn't just his anger guiding him now. It was his experience, a lifetime of staying steps ahead of the enemy. As the riders continued their destruction, they unknowingly crossed a line. And with every move they made, Joe felt the weight of his past preparing him for what was to come. What would happen when the riders finally realized who they were messing with? Would it be too late to turn back? The laughter of the riders echoed through the street, unaware that the situation was spiraling out of control. Joe's eyes locked onto the leader, the one with the spray can. His grip tightened, not in anger, but in a way that spoke of restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from years of understanding when to strike and when to wait. Every muscle in his body was primed, his senses sharp as he watched the group slowly escalate their pranks, pushing the van's limits further. One of the riders, sensing the shift, attempted to reach for his phone, likely to record or call for help. But Joe was already closer than they realized. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. The riders were trapped in their own arrogance, too far into the situation to back out now. But they didn't know what they were about to face. Joe's movements were swift, deliberate, a blur of precision that could only come from someone who had seen things most people could only imagine. And just as the riders began to fully grasp the mistake they had made, the first of them realized it was too late to turn back. As Joe closed the gap, the riders stumbled back, their cocky expressions now replaced with uncertainty. They were still underestimating him, thinking he was just another old man with a beat-up van. But the tension in the air was palpable. Something was about to snap. Just as Joe took another step forward, a sudden screech of tires broke the stillness. A black SUV skidded to a halt beside the scene, its engine roaring to life as the door swung open. From the vehicle, Two figures emerged, sharply dressed, with an air of authority that was immediately unsettling. They weren't cops. They weren't even locals. One of them, a tall man with a cold stare, glanced around quickly, sizing up the situation. The riders froze, caught off guard. The newcomer's eyes flicked over to Joe, and a subtle recognition passed between them, a flash of something that didn't belong in the moment. "You," the tall man muttered, his voice low, dangerous. "We need to talk." The riders were confused, unsure whether they should be more afraid of Joe or the men who had just arrived. But the real twist hadn't hit yet. As the second man reached into his coat, Joe's instincts flared, and his body tensed, ready for whatever came next. The tall man's hand didn't pull a weapon. Instead, it produced a small, weathered photograph, a photo of Joe in his military uniform, his face barely visible but unmistakable. Joe's heart raced. This wasn't just a random encounter. These men weren't here to help the riders. They were here for him. And now Joe had to decide: run, fight, or face a past he had tried so hard to forget. The photo hung in the air like a heavy weight, the cold stare of the tall man drilling into Joe. The riders, completely bewildered, stood frozen, not sure whether to stay out of the way or to run. Joe's mind raced, flashing back to a time when such confrontations were a regular part of his life. But this wasn't the battlefield. This was a quiet street, his peaceful life now shattered. "I don't know what this is about," Joe said, his voice steady, but his hands now clenching. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid the photo into his pocket, his eyes never leaving Joe's. "You don't remember us?" the man asked, his tone low but deadly. "We didn't forget you." Joe's pulse quickened. This wasn't about the van or the riders. It was personal. A dangerous old chapter of his life had come crashing back into his quiet existence. He had been expecting trouble, but not like this. Just as the man took a step forward, the second man, quieter but equally imposing, raised his hand to stop him. "Not yet. We have to be sure." That was when the twist hit. Joe's eyes darted from the riders to the two strangers. A memory flickered. A mission. A betrayal. "You're with them," Joe muttered, realization dawning on him. His breath caught in his throat. The riders weren't the target. They were pawns. Joe's former team had somehow found him, and now they were using these young men as bait to draw him out. "Get in your car and leave." Now, Joe growled at the riders, who didn't need to be told twice. They ran for their bikes, no longer thinking about the van they had just vandalized. But the two men were not so easily dismissed. Joe stood over them, eyes cold. "You came all this way for nothing." The taller man smiled darkly. "You always were one to make things interesting, Joe."